Hello there. Just a quick one. I'm so excited to announce that our next live audience recording of 3 Food Memories will be held on the 2nd of August on the Gold Coast as part of the Bleach Festival with Australian designer Alex Perry. For tickets and details, head to our website 3foodmemories.com. Enjoy the episode. Bye for now.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ground we stand on and thank them for allowing Papa to tell stories on these glorious lands we share.
Our guest on this episode of 3 Food Memories is a leading figure in Australia's literary and cultural landscape, a distinguished publisher, editor and intellectual who has played a key role in shaping Australia's literary voice. Over the course of her remarkable career, she has championed both emerging and established writers, consistently advocating for free expression and the power of ideas to spark public conversation and debate. Her aim has never been to divide, but to encourage people to think for themselves, to ask questions, to seek understanding and explore the why behind what we believe. It's a spirit we share. Louise Adler, welcome to 3 Food Memories.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
If you were to take the temperature of the population socially, emotionally and politically, what do you think's going on right now for humanity?
For humanity or for Australians, Sava? Because I think, if we were talking in America, the temperature would be quite different to the temperature here, wouldn't it? I think we're talking after the most recent federal election in Australia, and I think the result was very interesting, heartwarming given my own political views, but surprising that it seemed that overwhelmingly Australians were not persuaded by Trump-like politics or Trump-like attitudes. And I think that's wonderful to feel that we as a civil society reject that kind of divisive, angry, vulgar, crass kind of politics, the politics of resentment, the politics of disagreement, if you like. And I think that what we saw in this, both in the election itself, and there were some rude and crude moments in it, but overall the result seems to me to suggest that people want steady governance, steady government, a sense of justice and fairness prevailing. I think that's inspiring. That's all I can read out of the current moment here. If I look at the world more broadly, I think we're in a lot of trouble. We are seeing a raft of autocrats, rise to power, come to power in Europe, in the States, in the Middle East. We're seeing wars, we're seeing famine. And I think to myself, after all that some people of, my age and older have seen and known and understood about the 20th century, that in the 21st century, we're resolving our differences by bombing the hell out of civilians, innocent civilians, seems to me to be devastating, a devastating place to have landed after all we should know after the 20th century.
So do you think as Australians in the broader world landscape, do you think we're sheltered? Do you think we're protected? Do you think we've got no idea of what's going on? Are we literally sitting in a lucky country?
I think, Donald Horne was being ironic when he used the term the lucky country, but I do think we are in a privileged place. And I think it's quite interesting that Australians don't seem to recognise the privilege and the luxury of being remote. On the one hand, it's a disadvantage not to be the centre of the world, if you like. We're not living in New York, we're not living in London, we're not living in, wherever, and we're at the end of the world, if you like. But it's also what a great protected, sheltered environment we live in. I do think that. So when I think, for example, of our response, the collective response to asylum seekers, I think here we are with this huge country with resources and prosperity and security, and we are so unwelcoming or from my point of view, the kind of latent xenophobia that's always about to arise. It seems to me extraordinary given where we are geographically placed in the world. Our response to the referendum, the voice to Parliament, the statement from the heart, the Uluru Statement, that we as a country couldn't bring ourselves to recognise the importance and the fundamental place that first Australians have in the history of this place, I think is rather surprising that we did not have the generosity of spirit required to acknowledge that and welcome it and respect it. So it seems to me a great paradox. Here we are in the so-called, indeed, what is the lucky country now, and yet we don't live it as if we're lucky and privileged and can have a generosity of spirit to our fellow man, woman, person.
Your role as a book publisher and a Writers' Festival director, at the moment we are seeing people's opinions and facts being suppressed, aren't we? And discouraged, more to the point. We're being corralled. So what is the role? What do you see as the role of a festival director and, in fact, a publisher?
I think it's interesting. I think in both instances why I accepted the roles or have loved this, my professional life, the privilege of my own professional life, working life. It's because you've got the opportunity to curate and bring people together. And I don't mean in a kind of kumbaya sense, but to enable ideas that are of value, that are serious, that have credibility to circulate. And that's your privilege as a publisher, and it's certainly your privilege as a festival director, as a curator of a festival, and that you have that opportunity. I think people who are in the roles, the sorts of roles that I've occupied, who pretend or kind of or are adamant that they're a neutral purveyor of ideas or disseminator of ideas. I don't think that's true. I think we all bring our own histories and biases and interests to these roles. I published people that I thought were important and that were of significance, that would make a contribution.
Did you publish people whose views and opinions you necessarily didn't agree with just because you wanted them in the debate?
150%, and the person that comes to mind is Tony Abbott, of course, and many of my friends and many of my colleagues in the publishing company that I led and were rather surprised. What are you doing publishing Tony Abbott?
Why did you publish Tony Abbott?
Because I thought that it was important for us to understand the point of view that he represents, the conservative position. I knew that he could write. I knew that he was a person who was engaged in ideas, and I thought it was really important. I also thought, just at the most fundamental level, that we, MUP, Melbourne University Publishing, couldn't be a Labor pamphleteer, a disseminator of Labor or Greens or, progressive or left-wing views. We would have no credibility. So we had to be bipartisan in our publishing, but it was about quality. I wasn't going to publish people whose views were without any foundation, had no research behind them, were not well argued. And then there are the personal decisions you make. I would, if Pauline Hanson had come to me and asked for us at MUP to publish her memoirs, I would have said no because I didn't feel comfortable with those. Neither did I think I wasn't offered the opportunity, but if I had been offered the opportunity, I think I would have been skeptical about her capacity to write a good book. And that's a judgment, an editorial judgment, a high-handed editorial judgment. But it's also a judgment about the alignment with our own values, which is not to say I need to agree with Pauline Hanson, but it's to say we stand for a particular set of values and arguments in the public sphere. And my view was there will be a publisher for Pauline Hanson. There will be a publisher for Clive Palmer. There will be a publisher for Gina Reinhardt. And it didn't have to be MUP's role to publish all people who want to be published.
I said in my introduction that you always explore the why behind what we believe. So if I was to come to you and say, Louise, I would like to have Pauline Hanson on Three Food Memories, not to give her a platform for her views and her opinions, but to get an understanding of where she got them from, what are they based on, what would your advice be to me?
Problematic, isn't it? It's really tough, isn't it? Because on the one hand, yes, your role should be to not to expose, because I think you're a kind human being from the little we've known each other.
I do my best.
Yeah, you do. So do I want to have an insight into someone? Let's take it away from Pauline Hanson, because I want to sort of use adjectives that I think is your job, my job, to air the views of bigots, for example. Is that our role? I think you and I would understand where bigots find their views, how they're confirmed, and their opportunities to proselytise or to prosecute those views. Do we have to offer those people those opportunities? I'm not sure.
Well, see, I would like to actually know. We all start at the same spot. We all come from the same place. So what happens to humanity? I mean, this is a bigger thing for me. So what happens to humanity when we kind of splinter and all of a sudden we're working against each other?
But why do you think? I don't think we do come from the same place.
You don't?
No, I don't. I think I come from totally different. I mean, certainly everything in my background would be antithetical to, let's say, bigot X or bigot Y. My whole background is antithetical, oppositional, opposed to that, being formed and shaped by those views. So I don't feel like I come from that place. And so I've come to you might find this problematic. We've had a lot of discussions in recent times, but certainly since, the war on Gaza on October the 7th, the atrocities of October the 7th, a lot of, in my bubble, in the world I inhabit. And I've decided that I don't know that my job is to persuade in my personal life or in my professional life, that my job is to persuade, or that there is any point in me talking to those people whose views are so diametrically opposed to mine. We had some very, it's getting into the weeds here, but I think it's interesting about, whether there's anything we can exchange. People believe in dialogue, but people believe that I believe in respectful engagement. I wouldn't talk to anyone in a way, whatever their views, in a way that was disrespectful or unkind or lacking in consideration or an effort at an empathy to understand where they're coming from. But is it useful? Is it useful?
Have you always thought like this, or is this something that's come to you? I'm not going to use the term later in life.
I have become more and more. Firmly held views, I guess one might say. Others might call it dogmatism. Others might say that's not the way to operate in the world. I mean, but you don't. I guess let's wind back to the festival, for example, the Writers' Week, and to my publishing career. It was the opportunity to say and it is currently the opportunity to say, these ideas matter in the world. These ideas need to be ventilated. Who are the best people to talk to us about those ideas? So it's about their credibility. It's about the capacity for individuals to argue their case. In the instance of book publishing, it's the ability to write. So there are sort of, parts of this, sections, aspects to it that sort of splinter off and make who you want to talk to, who you want to publish, who you think should be published, or who you think should be at a festival on a stage, talking about their work. It narrows the field a bit. If you put in all those categories, those subsets of what constitutes quality, you just sort of reduce the options a little bit, I guess.
Speaking of quality, your food memories are extremely evocative. I just got lost, and they reminded me of fiction and non-fiction books that I've read over the years. So I was very much part of them. I mean, you clearly are a wordsmith. Do you think they are so evocative because the way you've written them, or because of the experiences that you're about to the experiences you're about to share with us?
The experiences, I find, even just writing, to you and sort of, just telling you these were some of my memories. They're hilarious. I think maybe other people will not find them hilarious. I find them hilarious because it's the life I had in all of its contradictions. It's all of its bizarreness. And I had a good life. Listen, it's not the privilege of class or money or any of that stuff. It's the privilege of cultural, ethnic richness. That's what brings, that's what makes them hilarious to me.
Are you a foodie?
Oh, yes, but I cannot make the cheesecake without cracking it, and I don't want anyone to tell me you need to put it in a bain-marie, in a water bath, not a bain-marie, a water bath, because I think that makes for a mussy cheesecake. And my cheesecake is the Continental European cheesecake. It hasn't got the crackers, the graham crackers base, the digestive biscuit base. It's none of that stuff, and it cracks. It looks like an earthquake, but all my friends who come say it's delicious. Maybe they're just being polite.
Now, your first food memory is the occasional weekend visits to the fruit salad farm in Marysville, Victoria.
The fruit salad farm. No, I don't want an oxymoron. I mean a fruit salad farm. There's nothing farm-like about it, apart from the fact you sat at sort of wooden tables with some ferns and stuff around. And obviously the Adler family, my grandparents and my parents, my maternal grandparents, my parents and my brother and I all pile into, it must have been a Holden, it would have been any other sort of car, and we'd be going for a day in the country. Now, a day in the country, my grandfather loved a walk in the forest. They were from Poland originally, and forest, restorative, fresh air, all of that business. But it was just really, how short could the walk in the forest? The Marysville, among the ferns. We'd open, that's right, on the way the windows would be open so we could inhale the fresh air and the lovely greenery as we passed by. My father would always speed up when we got to anything interesting. My mother would slow down, right? Because he wasn't interested at all. He was a Parisian man, so he didn't really care for anything rural at all. None of us did really. It was all a pretext. But my grandfather loved a bit of a walk. He thought that was very healthy, right? So we would have the walk, but really the destination was the fruit salad farm. And I've only met one other person who remembers the fruit salad farm. And it was really, I don't think there was anything else on the menu other than a bowl of fruit salad with vanilla ice cream or strawberries and cream. And I've got a gorgeous photo somewhere at home of, my grandparents and us sitting there. I'm beaming because I did like food, really, really. I was my nickname, and we're really getting into it now, was ponchka. A ponchka is a donut, but it's a Jewish donut that you have on Hanukkah, which is like a fried donut with jam in the middle. You can see what we're leading to. It's a roundness. One would have to say that Louise was a round child. So I'm beaming at the opportunity to have strawberries and cream and fruit salad. So the whole destination, so it would be like, I think probably 10 minutes in the forest and then speed on to the fruit salad farm. It wasn't a weekly thing, but was frequent, our visits to the fruit salad farm.
You grew up in Melbourne. What was that like growing up in the fifth? I don't want to age you here, but I'm going to let you do it. What was it like growing up then?
Well, I was born in 1954, so that tells you how old I am, right? So shocking number, shocking.
The same age as my mum.
Ah,
yes. So now I have context.
Now you have context. It was a good life. My father worked hard in business, but it was sort of good life. It was a safe. I didn't experience it as safe, but I think for my grandparent, it was a time of for us. I'm sure this is not accurate about the Australian life in general, but maybe they come here. I'd have to go back in history. I don't know how long we have. My mother and her parents came from Berlin in 1939. They fled. The Gestapo was knocking, demanding my grandfather come. Whatever, it doesn't matter. It's a very familiar story. They left. They went to Switzerland. They spent a year in Italy, and then they got a permit to come to Australia and came to Melbourne. And my father, his father was deported to Birkenau, and in 1941, he and his mother and sister survived, and they came out in 1948, after the war. My father was in the resistance in Paris. As a 14-year-old, he joined the resistance. So it's both different experiences, but familiar. Neither of my parents would have described them, well, they weren't, but they certainly, nor my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, would have described themselves as survivors. They weren't in concentration camps. They weren't, well, my grandfather was, but, they didn't, our lives weren't lived as the children, well, my brother and I, our lives weren't lived as the children of survivors. But certainly the experience of the Second World War, the annual commemorations, all of that was part of our background and part of our consciousness. And there was certainly work on the Council to Combat Anti-Semitism and Fascism and so on and so forth. So my parents were involved in that work, but they weren't there. My background, I didn't grow up as the child of traumatized survivors of the Holocaust. And whatever the traces and whatever the memories and whatever the kind of, all the families were, murdered, there's none of that. But in a way, life took over. Life in Elwood took over. And it was a safe life, a quiet life, and a good life. Food was plentiful. It was a European food, and it was plentiful. And it was a good life without it being, it wasn't we weren't a rich, it wasn't a rich family. It was a thoroughly middle class family life. But it was, I keep on saying it was a good life because that's my memory of it, that it was possible. I went to my brother and I went to state schools, and then we both went to private schools. My brother won a scholarship to Melbourne Grammar. I went off to MLC and then to Mount Scopus briefly. But life was good. I keep on saying it because that's my memory of it, that it was a safe and secure life.
Did your parents and your grandparents work very hard behind the scenes, like ducks paddling underwater, to keep life good for you?
Paradoxically, my parents both did adult matric. I can remember my parents very early on, and they sat at a desk together, at a table together, and they did adult matric while I was going matriculation year 12, and then they went to university. The values of the family were not to do with prosperity; they were to do with the life of the mind. So that was what they wanted to do. So earning a living gave one the ability to read, to go to concerts, to go to galleries, to have a cultured life, a life of culture.
A prosperity of a different kind.
Totally. They were of no interest. They weren't interested in business. They weren't interested in, acquisition of wealth or material goods. And that was certainly the values we grew up with.
Did you ever get a feeling that they were let down by their countries of birth? I often hear stories of people who just, I know within my own family, once they left, they were gone. There's a wonderful story of a man I heard that when he left his home country, he turned to the river and spat in it and never turned. And that's heartbreaking. Did you get that feeling from your family?
Well, my mother it took a very long time. It took until I was, in my 40s or 50s for my parents wouldn't buy German goods ever. And that was a no-no. And no German cars, no German equipment in the house, no white goods, none of that. And my mother never wanted to go back to Germany. We did, in fact, go back to Germany with her. That's another story. And very late in life, and it was a very interesting occasion. My father would have liked to go back to Paris when my parents first got married. He was, I think, always in a way he was a Frenchman, a Jewish Frenchman, if you like. And this was never his place, really. He didn't, he lived a life here. They had good lives here, but he wasn't of this place. I think he always felt slightly foreign.
As a Jewish Australian woman, are you of this place?
I don't feel of this place. There's so much of it that I don't feel is of me. I don't have that nationalist. When Max, my husband, says we, I say, who's we? But that's because he doesn't mean me and him and I. He means we Australians, the nationalism of it, the pride. I don't feel any of that because there were these other cultural influences coming in. The Jewish stuff and the Jewish heritage, absolutely secular. No religion. My grandparents weren't religious. My parents weren't religious. We didn't have any of that. But Jewish culture and traditions was deeply part of us. And I think that's what shaped me more than being of this place.
So speaking of Max, you are married to veteran Australian actor Max Gillies. Tell us about this wonderful marriage that you have. Or is it wonderful?
Wonderful in quotation marks. No, of course it's wonderful. I mean, I had been away from Australia for about 8 years, 10 years, and I came back and I thought, there are no decent men left in Australia. They've all been taken. I said to my girlfriend, if there's no one left, I'm off. I'm out. And she said, look, there's only one person I can think of who is left. He's kind, considerate and steadfast, and his name's Max Gillies. I'd never heard of him because I'd been away from Australia for, all that time in my 20s. And so he didn't have, had no meaning or consequence to me. Anyway, we met and, she said, we'll have a barbecue and you can meet him. And I came to the barbecue. I'd never gone on a blind date or anything. I thought, no, I can't do this. And then she said, and her husband was a little opposed to this matchmaking business, right? But of course, he was of no consequence, right? We just ignored him. I'm sorry, Bill. But Sue said, then she said, all right, I've had enough. We're going to have dinner, the four of us, at our home, and you and Max can see whether, you get on with each other. Will I tell you all the detail? I'll tell you all the detail. So I get ready. I buy a very casual but rather expensive, very no brand looking item, a little black T-shirt dress, because Melbourne, and this is the early 80s, 1981, I think it is. And I get dressed and I go out. I've spent a lot of effort to look like I've made no effort. And I leave my flat and I shut the door and I realise I've left the keys inside the house. I have to call a locksmith. The locksmith comes, whatever it is, $50 later, $100, whatever it costs to get a locksmith in those days.
In the 80s?
In the 80s. I don't know what it was, but I was tutoring at Melbourne University. I didn't have the money to be paying for locksmiths. Anyway, so he lets me in. I go in. The phone rings. It's a girlfriend ringing to wish me luck. I said, got to go. I'm late now. And so I go out. I've done it again. I've left the keys inside the house again. I always believed that it was my mother sitting on my shoulder saying, he's not Jewish, he's an actor in his 40s. That's not for you, Louise. Right? Anyway, I finally got to the dinner and we got on very well. And there was a Woody Allen film on. And Max had never met anyone in Australia who thought Woody Allen was funny. And I thought Woody Allen, these were the good old days. I thought he was hilarious and we bonded over that. And we've been together ever since. And I would say that my girlfriend Sue was right, that he is kind, considerate and steadfast. And I think that's what I wanted.
Together you produced two beautiful children?
Two beautiful children.
Two? I haven't left anyone out.
No, you haven't left anyone out.
But also, Max is an incredible mimic. He really has the ability to produce physical caricatures. I think of all the Australian politicians, monarchs and all the rest of it. Is there stuff that you see, of course keep it private, is there stuff that you see that we don't see as an audience?
Oh, yes.
Does he keep stuff for the family?
You mean hilarious?
Yeah.
No. What we get is the other side of the actor, the melancholic, the introvert. Although he'd go to the opening of an envelope, I always like that Australian idiom. Right? I love that. But the kind of the quiet person, he can be terribly funny. He can be very funny. But he and I don't know why, we still laugh at the same things all these years later. That's, there can be moments whether he's produced them or it's something we're watching and we can just, that's a great shared pleasure. But he's he's interested in the new, current affairs. He's a serious character other than on stage. It's tough. I'm still, 40 odd years later, I really don't understand what this acting business is all about. What happens to him? That he transforms into something else.
Do you use Max as a form of litmus paper of what you're working on? Do you test your stuff with him?
Yeah, he'd love me to talk to him more. But, after I've done the day of talking to writers and people, sometimes I think, I don't want to talk about it anymore. But of course he loves it. But he has been my support, best, barracker, supporter, enabler, facilitator. Never once has he said, well, he's much more cautious than I am. I'm devoid of caution, and it's got me into plenty of trouble in my time. But he is much more cautious than I am. But he's certainly my intellectual companion and the person, if I really need to test something or really need to think through something, he's the person I talk to. And he's he's a fabulous writer in my humble opinion, and he's a great editor. And when I'm writing and my tenses aren't really in order, I can always trust Max and his blue pencil to sort it out.
So behind every Louise Dynamo, there's a Max Maximus.
Maximus, cautious Maximus, careful. Where Louise is the once over lightly, he's Mr. Caution.
Your second food memory. Growing up, your food, as Australians would put it, was continental. From the continent.
From the continent.
So if it wasn't from the continent, it was from the Orient.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well, or it wasn't white. It wasn't white bread. I was thinking about it this morning before we talked, and I thought, the thing is, I would never have had a slice of white bread in my entire childhood. We didn't know about white bread. We would have rye bread and onion rolls. And or everything, but not white bread. Was that?
Is that because it was? Sorry.
No, it's just strange to us. Cotton wool.
So there were things like brisket, smoked salmon, egg salad. Chicken soup.
Yes.
That just keeps coming up
yes.
and coming up, and I want to highlight that. Your grandmother, though, she had excellent culinary skills.
She did. My grandmother was not someone to, if you said, like people say to me, well, can we have the cheesecake? Can you bring the cheesecake but make a small one? I say, it's not possible. It doesn't exist. Maybe other people can divide the kind of quantities. We don't. My grandmother only cooked in bulk. I don't mean that wasn't to be kept, but it was sort of like
the original Costco grandmother.
Totally. But like the sponge was this high. She was an amazing cook in the in the Middle European style. You know them as blintzes. We call them blintzes, like crepes, very fine crepes with cream cheese and raisins in them. Things you can get in Hungarian restaurants to today. Things like that. She was a superb cook in that style.
And so then we're talking the mid-60s. Your mum took French cooking classes.
She did. Now, my father was a lovely, lovely man. He wasn't demanding. He was he was funny. He had a very dry wit. It emerged in certain moments, and extraordinary moral compass, very clear moral compass about the world, and from very small details to the biggest principles in life.
I'm seeing that in you. I'm getting a sense of that in you.
If only I miss his moral judgment. I would have so wished that he was around now during these dark times for me to discuss the issues with him, not just because I loved him and he was a wonderful father, but because he had a very good mind. He and he could hold the contradictions and the complexities. He was a real, an intellectual, really. But anyway, that's another question. So to my mother, the French guy. So Dad wasn't a demanding individual, but my mother did. I remember my mother saying to me, she realised that after about 10 years of marriage, the first 10 years, she had every night she would cook a piece of sort of fillet, but a cut of meat. It was very thin, like a quickly fried steak with garlic and butter and with some potato. I can't remember what else was there. But he would have that meal every night. He just liked that meal. It was like a French, a sort of very flash fried, I think we'd call it now, very simple, but that was what it was. And she decided she was just not going to do that anymore. We would always, as we were growing up, always have a salad with a vinaigrette, not the Australian salad with, canned beetroot and the rest of it. It was a sort of a proper lettuce salad, leaf salad. And of the sort that one could get in those days, not the variety you can get nowadays, brilliant variety you can get nowadays. But she decided that she would, because he loved French food. He really loved French food. That was his thing. And so she went off to Madame de Stoop, who when I've researched her, it turns out to be Belgian. And I still have the recipe books that she had, that my mum wrote, the handwritten recipes, and she gave them to me. The filet douglet, the onion soup, the chocolate mousse. I mean, all these things are sort of, cliches today. But in the 60s in Elwood, it was deeply exotic. And she did that beautifully. She was a very good cook. So every Friday, and we didn't light candles. It was a Friday night of gathering. A family and friends would come for a lovely meal. And still, even when my kids were little, we'd go to my mum's on a Friday night, and she would always cook. And so that was it. So there was the French food. So and we all relished it. We all loved it. I think we loved food. I think while I'm talking to you, I'm thinking we loved food. It wasn't something to eat and run. It was it's relished.
So your Parisian father, you said he wasn't demanding, but he missed France. He missed French. He wasn't of this place. How did you see that more and more as you grew older?
As I understood more about him, in a way, and he had these records, and I don't know that anyone would know these. He would get these records in the early days when we lived in Elwood. He would get this like a plastic, like a 45 single with, Yves Montand singing, and that wasn't Charles Aznavour because he would have thought that was déclassé, but, Yves Montand, whoever, whatever. I remember this, yearning for French culture. And he had left France. I think he might have been, he was born in 27. He leaves in 48. He's just under 20 or something like that. So he's a young man, but deeply of that, and never, his accent was always, we'd call it French, Yiddish, English, French English, and he couldn't say Freud. He would say Freud, it was there, I should tell you there's one food memory that he had. He remembers he loved tripe, and French people love tripe, but they don't have tripe here in Australia, whatever. But the one food memory he had is of getting a parcel during, maybe at the end of the Second World War, from Australian cousins that were here, relatives. And it was a blue package with sort of silver wrapped around this yellow bar. And he and his friends opened this and they thought, this is an interesting soap. It doesn't really lather. It turned out to be Kraft cheese. So that was one of his very strong memories. The foil, I don't know that it probably doesn't
Yes,
get made
yeah.
anymore, but he sort
Not
of...
that way.
Yeah, that's
Not
right.
that way. Let's talk about you now. Your politics, your opinions, your views, your thises, your that's, everything that is Louise. On the surface, you seem to court controversy, but simply put, you're just allowing both sides of the argument to speak. You've laid a table for the audience to make their own decision. Am I right there?
In part. I certainly haven't. Certainly, for example, at Adelaide Writers' Week, I wasn't out to court controversy. That's not. These were the issues of the day. If we're talking about the Middle East, for example, or the Trump redux, there's no way that a festival of what's being written about today, what's being, what the books that are being published, the commentary that's being published, it's about the world. And for us to do a festival that ignores all of that would be so dissonant, and so we would be irrelevant. And you could say, well, this year, for example, there were 160,000 people that came to Adelaide Writers' Week, and the sessions on the contemporary issues, both politics and social issues of the day, were absolutely crowded. You couldn't get a seat. And I'm not just talking literal politics. And when Grace Tame came to Writers' Week, it was full. The questions of sexual identity, sexual consent, workplace conduct, social issues, of equal importance. And it's not just straight politics that preoccupies us, and why I've opened up space for those kinds of conversations. It's because people are hungry to understand.
And they're hungry to understand. Are they leaving satisfied?
Yes. Yeah. I think. Well, engaged. It's a privilege. I think it's a privilege for all of us. David Remnick, who's the editor of the New Yorker, had a conversation with Sarah Ferguson during the festival this year. Well, people wanted to hear from an American right in the heart of from the New Yorker, that prestigious magazine, but also from the heart of New York and the New York sense of what's going on in America today. So I think you feel informed. It may. I don't know that they're not revelatory. There's some of these conversations are not revelatory, but they're insightful. You're having another way to think about it, or you're understanding something you didn't understand before about how someone else views what's going on in America, for example. I should also say there were other conversations that were just as important, the political ones. Geraldine Brooks, her husband, Tony Horowitz, another very well-known journalist, American journalist, dropped dead in the middle of the street. And she was informed she was not with him, tragically, and she was informed about his death. We had a conversation, we programmed a conversation between Geraldine Brooks and Bob Carr, the former Premier of New South Wales, whose wife had also dropped dead in a hotel room, equally traumatically. That was an extremely significant and powerful conversation that the audience were really collectively both moved by and I think took away a great deal from how we manage grief. So there are those deeply human experiences that you want to hear. As I'd like to say this myself as an audience member, you want to hear how people who've reflected deeply on those questions have handled that in their own life experience. So, it's not just straight politics that we do or I care about. It's those, what do we make of the loss of our loved ones and how do we make sense of that?
Do you have an enormous sense of responsibility when it comes to bringing these stories to a platform like Adelaide's Writers' Festival?
Yeah, we did think, for example, about how people go away from a conversation. You could see people, dabbing their eyes. There are plenty of people. We've all had tragically. That's a universal experience, loss. And how do people go away? Is there comfort for them? What's the solace they find? And you try to curate the right people to have a conversation that isn't so immersed in their own grief exhilarate, whether it's grief or whether it's joy, that they allow space, they allow an opportunity for the audience to engage.
I've read somewhere that you said there are times when you impress your opinion and you won't be swayed. What are those issues?
I think the voice to Parliament, the state of the failure of us in Australia to reconcile with our history seems to me to be, there is no other side from my point of view. In terms of the Middle East and the war on Gaza, I think there is no other side than the bombing, 2,000-pound bombs, being coming down on Palestinian innocent civilians. What are we talking about? 18,000 children so far, or 15,000? The number is horrific. The devastation is horrific. I think all of that is just unconscious. I think there is no other side, which is not to. And I don't think the answer to that or the correlative. And I can hear people saying, "But what about October the 7th?" I don't think that one does not annul or equate or kind of balance out the other. They are two separate catastrophic moments, all a result of an occupation for so many years of Gaza and the West Bank, and the inability to make a just peace that supports the rights of individuals to live in freedom in that place in the Middle East. I know that sounds like a speech, but I don't mean it as a speech.
In private, you must just close the door and find yourself in a state of verklimption. I mean, how do you process that? I mean, do you process stuff private? I mean, I know I do with what's going on. What do you do with that when it gets you to when it just gets so into your bone and that you feel so helpless? What do you do?
I keep thinking about it. I keep those images. We're in this. It's a cliche to talk about social media and what's going on in the that we've all got access to the images. It looks to me like Hiroshima. Gaza looks to me like Hiroshima. I think it is. As I said at the beginning, the 21st century. This is how we resolve this impasse. Is that the solution? Clearly, it's not the solution. And I feel people say to me, "I don't want to see any more. I don't want to look." I don't think we are entitled not to look. People say, I don't want to watch. I watch anything that's about the Holocaust because that's part of my own history. People say to me, I don't want to see another film about it. I don't want to see another documentary. I think it's incumbent. I'm not judging other people's, their wish to look away. I think it's certainly incumbent upon me to look, not to look away.
Let's move on to your third food memory.
What's my third food memory? I can't remember.
You persuaded your mother to accept an invitation from the German government to return to Berlin. You said, the family were like, no German this, no Volkswagens. There was going to be no German anything happening in the Adler house because her parents had fled in 1939. Tell me the story about the story that they shared with you about her fleeing Germany.
Okay, so my grandparents, my mother's parents had moved from, my grandfather had been taken as a prisoner of war in the First World War to Germany. Only my grandfather, I think, would have looked at from the prisoner of war and wherever he was and said, this is an interesting place, metropolitan, urbane, civilized society. I'm coming back. Right, he's a prisoner of war in the First World War. He goes back to Poland. He marries my grandmother. And they leave like many, many people did. A lot of Jews left Poland, Russia, and so on and so forth, and went to France or went to Germany or went to Austria, went to more cosmopolitan, urbane, and metropolitan cities. Berlin in the 1920s was exciting. It was, the Weimar Republic, the dynamic, life and culture and all that it was, and the home not just purportedly, the home of everything that was significant in culture, all the composers, the poets, the writers, the artists, So they go to Germany in the mid-20s. I think must go to Berlin in the late 20s, mid-20s. My mum is born in 1931. I think she's 7 or 6 when she goes to school. One day she goes to school. This is after Kristallnacht. She goes to school. And she's vilified as a little Jewish girl. She never goes back to school. I think it might have been kindergarten, right? First day of kindergarten. And there's a photo of her. They always had great big white bows in their hair. And they were given a dunce, sounds so German, a dunce's cap full of lollies on their first day at school to celebrate going to school. But she remembers the vilification by the teacher. She never returned. And my grandmother remembers, I'm sorry, I'm going back and rewinding slightly. She remembers being pregnant with my mother. And I remember her telling me that before, when she was pregnant and she would walk along the street with a shopping basket, Berliners would come up to her and say, gnädige Frau, dear Frau, lady, let me help you with your basket. The day after Kristallnacht, she was pushed off the footpath. That overnight, the atmosphere in Berlin changed dramatically to anyone who was Jewish, and she must have been identifiably Jewish, but overnight it changed. So in 1939, my grandfather gets a note from the Gestapo, please report to the police headquarters. He says, I'll go to my grandmother, and I'll go to labour camp like I did last time, the First World War. My grandmother, smart lady, says, you can do that if you like, I'm off, we're out. So she and my mother went on a train, crossed the border. My mother had to hide her face in my grandmother's lap because she had a little Jewish face with a little, curly hair. She hid while they crossed the border over into Switzerland. My grandfather said he would stay to try and get some money, and because they had a warehouse of clothing business, but a warehouse, sort of not a retail business. And he would try to get some money out. By that time, the banks were, Jewish people couldn't get their money out of the bank, couldn't get anything. He tried to organise with a smuggler, which is what people did, for him to bring money over. Of course, totally naive. My grandfather was a lovely, lovely man, but an innocent abroad. Of course, that money nothing happened. He then got on a train and came to Switzerland. And my grandmother and mother are waiting on the train station at the station, and the train comes in that he's supposed to be on. He doesn't appear. My grandmother thinks he's not coming. He's finished. He's gone. He's been caught by the Gestapo. Finally, my grandfather, everybody's left the train. My grandfather appears. Where were you? My clever grandfather hid in the toilets. Where were the Germans? I've looked in the toilets. Anyway, they're safe. It's a happy story. And they stay in Switzerland, then they go to Italy, and then they come to Australia. So they settle in Melbourne, and I think they had no relatives here at the time. And then after the war, my grandfather found his brother and sister. They had gone to Russia during the war, and he brought them out to Australia. And of course, they were my great uncle, if he would be, I suppose, or his brother, his first wife and children had been killed in concentration. These are all broken families. These are all broken stories. There's it's nothing left. My grandmother's entire family in Poland, there was nothing left of them, and nothing much of my grandfather's either. There's no one left. So a way of thinking back to you asking me about what life in Elfwood was like, no extended family. And I suppose most of my generation of, children of, whose parents were in the Second World War or came as refugees during the Second World War or just before, none of us have got extended families. There's no big family to get together. There's no extended family. So it become very tight. You're very close. It matters a great deal. Family matters a great deal to you. Anyway, so that's the story of them coming to Australia. And so there's no relationship, there's no interest. My grandfather refused to take reparations from the German government. They were handing out, reparations. If you wanted, he refused to take blood money, as many Jewish people did. He wanted nothing to do with them. So that was the end of that. Anyway, fast forward probably, 60 years or something like that, 50 years. And my mother gets an invitation from the Berlin city government or council, I don't know what it was called. And they were inviting they wouldn't call them, they weren't deportees, but returnees, these people who, as children, had fled to come back on a sort of, hosted a visit, to be honoured by the city. And my mum didn't want to go, but we persuaded her. I'd been to Berlin a couple of times because I go to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and I went to Berlin. I thought it was fascinating. I loved it. Anyway, so we embarked on this trip. My mother, who had never spoken German, her German came, unbelievably, she understood. So I understand a little bit of German because Yiddish is so close to German, but she really understood it. Stuff came back. She remembered that the department store that I wanted to take them to, because I thought they'd enjoy it, and she remembered that it had been a Jewish business and had, of course, been taken over by the Nazis during the rise of the Nazis. It was called Tietz, I think, was the family that owned it. Anyway, I knew, as we do have a passion for food, our family, and we're not lacking in interest in the subject. I thought, I know what my mother will enjoy and my father will enjoy or marvel at. It's the food hall at the top of the renowned department store, the KaDeWe, right? So up we go. It is like a homage and like a church, a religious experience to those of us who understand rye bread, potato salad, and schnitzel. And herring, right? And I realised that my parents had left Europe, but Europe had definitely not left us and our stomachs. That is for sure. And how many ways can you do schnitzel? How many ways can you do potato salad? It is infinite. And Germans' service culture, very efficient but charmless. But it doesn't matter. It's just done with such efficiency, But anyway, it was something to behold. Something to behold.
Let's bring you now to what's going on in Israel. How do you process the Israeli military operation in Gaza?
I'm completely appalled by it. I think it's an abomination. I think it's genocide. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't mind if lawyers want to parse the word till the cows come home. I think it's genocide. I think these are war crimes. I think the government is appalling. I don't understand why the progressives in Israel have not been able to prevail. This occupation will bring peace neither to the Palestinians nor to Israeli society, or civil society. I think it is appalling. And I can't but say we have to stand up and say, not in our name.
I'm thinking from the stories that you've shared with me today, the processing goes beyond your cerebral and intellectual realm. There's human impact, the emotional and physical toll, and somehow you've got to find moral and ethical dimensions. Is this what fuels you to do the work that you do with the Jewish Council?
Yes, I do. I do think it's incumbent upon us and to speak up. And I think it was important. I give all credit to the next generation who invented the Jewish Council, if you like, created it, because it was their view that we needed to be able to provide the media with an alternative view of what's going on. That, the Jewish establishment would like it to be, would like the media and civil society to understand that all Jews support Israel till the end. I do not hear a sliver of skepticism, concern, or care from the Jewish establishment, and haven't since October the 7th, for the plight of Palestinians, or the willingness to urge for a peaceful solution and a just peace. And I think in that context, it is incumbent upon those of us who are appalled at what's going on to say we stand up and we will speak. Now, I'm in a privileged position. I have nothing to lose. I've had my professional life, my reputation is what it is. For those who disagree with me or think I'm a persona non grata or a capo, what is it called, as I've been called?
What's a capo?
A capo is a collaborator with the Nazis in the concentration camps. People of talk about lack of moral morality and decency. So it's the worst thing you can call someone, or a self-hating Jew, or an anti-Semite. I mean, all these names. I don't care. If that's your view, so be it. We don't really have to. We're not going to sit down and discuss these issues with any rationality or civility. So it's neither here nor there to me. But so I'm at a stage in my life where I don't care about that. I care that there are voices, and if my voice can help create the context and put pressure on our government, irrelevant power as we are in the scheme of things around the Middle East, but yet as one more nation to say we do not accept this. This is not the way that civil society and decent people act, or decent governments act in these moments. And if we can encourage our government to do that, then I think I believe I should be part of it.
These millennials who've set up the Jewish Council, what do you see in them? What support do you give them to do the work that they do?
Along with other people of, seniority, if you like. I don't want to call us. They call us the elders. I think, oh my God, am I really an elder? Yes, Louise.
You've arrived.
I am. Unfortunately, I'm an elder. Oh, I cannot believe I'm an elder. I don't feel like an elder. But anyway, I am an elder.
You don't sound like one.
Yeah, but get with the program, Louise. Yield to the reality. Anyway, but all we can do is lend our voices and our expertise and our experience to these people, these young people. But these millennials are so energetic, so capable. It's so inspiring. I can't tell you. They're smart. They read. They think. They can write. They can argue their case. They're articulate.
But you can do all these things too. Let's be clear.
But it's not. But it's for them to talk to their generation. It's easy for me. But they have much more at risk. They have jobs. They have professional lives. They have there are consequences for them. they work in law firms, they work in universities, to stand up and say what you've got to say and defend those views that are not accepted. That takes courage.
And are they receiving any backlash? Are they receiving
Of course. At the family level, they're vilified. At the public level, they're vilified at every turn. And the certainly News Limited is running a campaign of vilifying anyone who puts their head up above the parapet. I've been, it doesn't matter to me. I was, people call for me to be sacked, for me to be sacked from directing Adelaide Writers' Week. Are you serious? Really? They were. They didn't succeed.
I was about to say they haven't succeeded.
They haven't succeeded.
Yeah.
With support from, I must say, interestingly, support from the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, who I think's got a touch of the Obamas about him. I think he's a very impressive character. Actually found it very difficult the first year that I did Adelaide Writers' Week. There were great objections to two Palestinian writers. I thought they were wrong, but whatever. He was put under enormous pressure, and he actually gave a speech at our opening night in which he described his own ambivalence, his sense that he himself did not agree with one of the social media feeds from one of the writers. And yet he landed, I think he took about 10 minutes to make this speech, and he landed on the point that we should all land on, or all politicians should land on. He arrived at the conclusion that if politicians were to start intruding and deciding on culture, on what gets published or what gets performed, and we might as well be living in Russia. And I thought it was, if I could have sent his speech to all the other premiers of all the other states, where and Creative Australia that's cancelled Khalid Sabsabi appearing at the Venice Biennale, and the federal government, all the ways in which cancellations have happened across the public sphere in the last 3 years. If I could have sent his speech to those politicians, I think maybe that would have enabled them to see why it is not appropriate for politicians to determine what gets performed or what gets published or what gets spoken, what gets said and what doesn't.
We have an MFK Fisher serve it forth tradition here at TFM. What would you like to serve forward to our next guest?
Can I serve my cracked cheesecake?
You can. Is it cheesecake on crack, or has it got a crack in it?
No, it's cracks like tectonic plates moving apart. But you can cut a slice. It's a cheesecake. It's not a pie, Sava.
Okay, so a final question. In the 2005 film Munich, Avner, the Eric Bana character, says to the Geoffrey Rush's character, "There's no peace at the end of this, no matter what you believe. You know this is true." I ask myself this. Why do we keep making the same mistakes? I mean, you are all ears to all voices. What do you think needs to be said for all of us to listen and take action?
It's terrible to think. I can't stop thinking about there's no peace. There has to be peace, doesn't there? There has to be. And we've seen that there have been moments where we've all come together and said, no, this can't go on. Wars that have stopped, cruelty that stopped. And I want to believe that the story of humanity is a story of progress, of kindness, that we've been able to evolve. I have to hold on to that. If I don't hold on to that, if we don't, not just me, I sound so self-absorbed, but, if one doesn't hold on to that, what is the point?
Thank you for being the stateswoman we seek, an unwavering voice of clarity and justice, even when it comes at your own cost. Louise Adler, thank you so much.
And thank you so much for a lovely conversation.
That's it for this episode of 3 Food Memories. Be sure to spread the plated love and check out our 60-plus back episodes. They're still as delicious as they were when they came out of the oven. For all things TFM, head to the socials at 3 Food Memories for more info, and to send us a message, head to 3foodmemories.com. 3 Food Memories is edited by Lauren McWhirter with original music by Russell Torrance. Nasta kalafili, and bye for now.
Thank you for listening to Papa's podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe.